In today's video, we head over to Belfast, where an enforcer who took a €100,000 down payment to kill one of Ireland's most wanted man at time. The job was meant to end with the death of Gerry "the Monk" Hutch, the head of the Hutch organised crime group. Instead, the hit would never happen, and Hutch would walk free from the special criminal court, and the man promised the big payout would find himself back in prison. Before we continue, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and drop a comment with your thoughts. It really helps us to keep bringing you in-depth true crime stories. Thank you. Now let's dive back in. We go back to 2017, when Daniel Kinahan was running his cartel from the shadows in Dubai. Under immense pressure after the deadly Regency Hotel attack, he wanted the Monk taken out. For that, he turned to Gerard Mackin, a thug from West Belfast with a history of extreme violence. A man with convictions for torture with a nail gun, crucifying victims to slabs of concrete, shooting taxi drivers during sectarian feuds, and forming his own terror cell after being overlooked for promotion within the Irish National Liberation Army. Kinahan promised Mackin €1 million if he was able to do the hit. To show he was serious, Daniel handed over €100,000 in cash as a down payment. Mackin was flown into Dublin to meet and collect the money for the hit and told to find an opportunity to kill Gerry Hutch. But in a twist that nobody expected, Hutch would later be found not guilty of murder at the Regency Hotel trial. The verdict would see him walk out the front doors of the Central Criminal Courts of Justice, while Mackin was left in Portloy's prison, guilty not of murder but of money laundering. Back in September 2015, the fragile peace between two of Ireland's most notorious families shattered. Gerry Hutch's nephew, Gerry Hutch, was shot dead in Marbella, Spain. That killing was allegedly ordered by Daniel Kinahan, and it started one of the bloodiest gangland feuds in Irish history. From that moment, the Hutch family and the Kinahan Cartel were at war. The violence came to a head on the 5th of February 2016 at the Regency Hotel in North Dublin. Masked men dressed in tactical gear, armed with AK-47 assault rifles, stormed the hotel lobby during a boxing weigh-in. Their target was Daniel. He escaped unharmed, but Kinahan Lieutenant David Byrne was shot dead. The images of men in police-style uniforms running through the hotel lobby with assault rifles shocked the country. It was a declaration of war. The fallout was immediate. Kinahan's crew began a wave of retaliatory hits across Dublin. Hutch associates were murdered one by one, often in broad daylight, as the cartel tried to wipe out their rivals. In response, the Hutch side tightened their circle. Houses were put under armed Garda watch, associates went into hiding, and Gerry Hutch himself disappeared from view. The feud escalated so quickly that the Gardaí launched a major security operation. Armed checkpoints appeared on Dublin streets, convoys of detectives monitored the homes of potential targets, and the Special Criminal Court began handling cases connected to the war. Politicians called it the most serious threat to the state since the days of paramilitary violence. Meanwhile, Daniel Kinahan was cementing his position abroad. From Dubai, he orchestrated his empire, insulated from day-to-day risks on the streets of Dublin. But one name continued to haunt him: Gerry Hutch. Known as the Monk, Hutch was a veteran of the Dublin underworld. He had built his reputation as a careful and calculating figure, someone who had survived long enough to become a symbol of defiance against the cartel. For Kinahan, letting Hutch live was not an option. The feud had already claimed dozens of lives, but Hutch remained at the center of it all, respected, feared, and still standing. The cartel leadership wanted him dead, and for that, they were willing to pay big money. That is when Gerard Mackin entered the picture. By 2019, Mackin was back on Irish soil after years moving between Belfast, Dublin, and Spain. A man with a proven history of violence, known for torture, shootings, and extortion, he was exactly the kind of enforcer Kinahan wanted for the job. The down payment was set at €100,000, with the promise of 10 times that amount once the Monk was taken out. The Hutch-Kinahan feud had turned Dublin into a battleground, and it was about to draw in one of Belfast's most notorious paramilitary enforcers. The stage was set for a murder that never happened, but the fallout would change everything. To understand how Gerard Mackin ended up with a €1 million bounty contract, we have to go back to his beginnings in West Belfast. Born into a community scarred by sectarian violence, Mackin grew up surrounded by paramilitary influence. By his late teens, he was already immersed in that world, aligning himself with the Irish National Liberation Army. But even among men hardened by decades of conflict, Mackin stood out for his sheer brutality. In 2009, he became the first first person ever to be convicted in a Dublin court for a murder committed in Belfast. The charge related to the shooting of taxi driver Eddie Burns. But in 2010, that conviction was overturned by the Court of Criminal Appeal. A retrial was ordered, but it collapsed after only 3 days. With witnesses too terrified to testify, Mackin walked free. It was a pattern that would follow him, with violence so extreme that victims were often too scared to speak in court. In September 2015, Mackin was part of a 3-man team that tortured a man in one of the most sadistic assaults the Irish courts had ever heard. The victim was nailed to the floor with a nail gun, beaten with sticks, and left with lasting injuries. Mackin and his accomplices laughed during the attack. In court years later, one witness recalled him saying the attempt on the man's life was a bit of a laugh. His alliances shifted constantly. He once worked under Irish National Liberation Army boss, but fell out after being denied a leadership role. Instead, he formed his own breakaway faction known as the New Irish National Liberation Army, a ragtag group that mixed paramilitary violence with gangland ambition. By the time of the Hutch-Kinahan feud, most of his faction had either disbanded or drifted into organised crime. Mackin himself moved between Spain and Ireland, maintaining links with both dissident Republicans and cartel figures. In 2019, he was back in Dublin, closely tied to Daniel Kinahan and tasked with helping run a supply line into Ireland. He was exactly the type of criminal who thrived on chaos, equally at home in a political feud or a gangland war. When Kinahan handed him €100,000 to kill Gerry Hutch, it was the biggest job Mackin had ever been given, but it would prove to be the beginning of his downfall. By 2019, Daniel Kinahan was firmly entrenched in Dubai. He had turned the desert city into his command center, away from Irish justice, but still pulling the strings of the cartel's empire across Europe. His organization was under pressure. Many of his associates had been arrested, assets were being seized, and the Hutch gang remained a thorn in his side. At the very center of that threat was Gerry the Monk Hutch. Kinahan decided to put a price on his head, €1 million. It was a staggering bounty, even in gangland terms, enough to tempt only the most ruthless of enforcers. For Kinahan, the choice of who would carry out the job was simple. He needed someone who had proven he could instill fear, someone without hesitation, someone with no ties left to lose. That man was Gerard Mackin. At the same time, Mackin was given a broader role. He was tasked with overseeing one of the cartel's supply line into Ireland. The Kinahan leadership saw him as a valuable asset, a man who could keep product moving while also hunting down their greatest rival. But Mackin's return to Dublin raised eyebrows. He was a Belfast thug, now walking among cartel heavyweights, men who viewed themselves as new age gangsters, businessmen rather than gunmen. His background in dissident paramilitaries and torture squads made him volatile, unpredictable. To some, he was a useful enforcer. To others, a liability waiting to explode. While the contract loomed, the reality of killing Gerry Hutch was more complicated than Kinahan made it sound. Hutch was a seasoned operator, surrounded by family, friends, and a community that still shielded him. Gardaí had his home under surveillance since the Regency Hotel attack. Moving on him would require more than just brutality. It would take precision, planning, and luck. For Mackin, the contract was finished before it ever began. The €1 million payday vanished. Instead of being remembered as the man who killed Gerry Hutch, he was left with nothing but the advance money in his pocket and the eyes of the law closing in. The monk survived the feud, with his name intact, with Daniel always on the run, and Mackin's path leading back to prison walls. The story of Gerard Mackin's downfall didn't come with the kind of headline he expected. There was no dramatic trial for the murder of Gerry Hutch, not a cross-examination about a €1 million contract. Instead, Mackin found himself in front of the Special Criminal Court on a far smaller charge of money laundering. In December 2022, he was extradited from Alicante in Spain on a European arrest warrant. Gardaí had built a case that tied him to €4,760, believed to be the proceeds of drug dealing. For a man who had tortured victims and had once been offered a fortune to kill Ireland's most wanted man, the sum was almost laughable, but it was enough to bring him back into custody and hold him in Portlaoise prison. Inside court, Mackin cut a very different figure from the hardman reputation he carried on the streets. His barrister, Ronan Kennedy, told the judges that Mackin had turned his life around. He had a new baby with his long-term partner. He had steady work with a building firm in Spain. He was, the court was told, a family man who had made poor choices in the past. The defense tried to frame him as a man shaped by circumstances. Kennedy said alcohol was a problem in Mackin's family and that his client had struggled for years. He asked the court to show leniency, but the reality was inescapable. Mackin was not a victim spectrum of circumstance. He was a notorious enforcer with a record of torture, extortion, and attempted murder. Gardaí described him as volatile, unpredictable, and deeply dangerous. Even his own breakaway, New Irish National Liberation Army faction had collapsed, its members drifting back into mainstream gangland crime. While Mackin was being painted as a man seeking redemption, Gerry Hutch was walking free. In April 2023, after a high-profile trial, Hutch was acquitted of the Regency Hotel murder. The judges ruled the evidence simply wasn't there. For Hutch, it was vindication. For Mackin, it was humiliation. He had been promised €1 million for Hutch's life. Instead, he was now pleading guilty to laundering less than $5,000. The courtroom became a theater of irony. The target free, the hitman behind bars, the cartel in retreat. Justice Mrs. Burns of the Special Criminal Court summed up the case with clinical precision. Mackin's guilty plea was noted. His claims of family responsibility were acknowledged, but the weight of his history and his associations were impossible to ignore. He was sent back to Portlaoise prison, surrounded by cartel gunmen and paramilitary veterans, the very people he once claimed he would kill for money. In the end, it wasn't the violence that nailed him, it was the paperwork. The aftermath of Gerard Mackin's conviction was a picture of brutal irony. The man who had been promised €1 million payday was now sitting in Portlaoise prison. Meanwhile, Gerry Hutch, the man he was meant to kill, walked free from the Special Criminal Court and returned to his family life in Dublin. For Mackin, prison was no unfamiliar territory. He had spent years in custody before, both in the paramilitary wings and later among ordinary gangland inmates. But this time was different. He was now housed alongside members of the Kinahan Cartel, the very men who had once offered him a fortune. Patrick Hutch, convicted cartel hitmen, and other foot soldiers of the feud all shared the same walls. It was a bitter reminder that he was no longer the feared outsider with his own cell of gunmen, but just another inmate. Inside, tensions brewed. Reports surfaced of clashes between Mackin's old New Irish National Liberation Army loyalists and members of the Bayern organised crime group, the cartel faction once led in Dublin by Liam Bayern. Mackin, who had built his reputation by violence, was now forced to navigate prison politics just to survive. On the outside, Gerry Hutch was careful. Sources close to him said he had no plans to flee abroad. Instead, he chose to remain in the capital, relying on the loyalty of family, friends, and a close community to keep watch. His brother Patsy's home stayed under round-the-clock Garda surveillance, while associates like James Margot Gately lived under constant threat after multiple assassination attempts. For them, the feud was far from over, but the reality was clear. The Kinahan Cartel was in retreat. Their leadership had fled to Dubai, their networks had been dismantled in Ireland, and their reputation battered by international sanctions. For Hutch, the danger remained, but the storm that had threatened to wipe out his family had passed its peak. For Mackin, the storm had closed in on him alone. The contrast could not be sharper. Hutch, once branded the most wanted man in Ireland, smiled as he told reporters it was the right decision. Mackin, once the feared enforcer promised riches, was reduced to a courtroom plea about wanting to be a family man. The man who had crucified others with nail guns now spoke about nappies and construction work in Spain. To Gardaí, the case became an example of how organised crime often collapses under its own weight. Big promises of loyalty and money mean little when the leaders are abroad, the targets are still breathing, and the enforcers are left to face the courts alone. For Mackin, there would be no redemption. His history was too violent, his reputation too toxic, and his future now tied to a prison number. For Hutch, the irony was that freedom came with its own cage. The constant threat of one last hit, the knowledge that the dying sting of the cartel could still come. When you strip this case back, what's left is a story of irony, survival, and wasted lives. Gerry Hutch, the man who was supposed to die in a hail of bullets, instead walked free from the Special Criminal Court. Gerard Mackin, the man promised €1 million payday, now sits in Portlaoise prison, guilty of laundering less than $5,000. The contrast is almost absurd. Hutch returned to his community, older, cautious, but still standing. He remains a target, always looking over his shoulder, but his reputation intact. Mackin, once a feared enforcer who nailed men to slabs and laughed about torture, tried to convince a court that he was a family man who just wanted a new start in Spain. The judges didn't buy it. The lesson is clear. In organised crime, ambition rarely ends with riches. More often it ends with betrayal, prison, or death. Mackin believed in the promise of a €1 million bounty. He believed his violent past made him the right man for the job. What he didn't see was that he was just another disposable tool in a feud that has already chewed up dozens of men before him. For Hutch, freedom is no victory parade. His life remains under constant threat, his family watched by armed Garda units, his movements limited by the shadow of the Kinahan Cartel. For Mackin, prison is a slow punishment, a reminder that his brutality didn't buy him respect, only notoriety. Researching this case shows how often these stories end the same way. Big names, big reputations, promises of untouchable power. But in the end, it's the smallest details that bring them down. Not the AK-47s or the €1 million contracts, but a bank transfer of €4,760. Not the violence itself, but the paperwork. Sometimes the system doesn't catch the crime you expect. It catches the ones left in the margins. And for men like Mackin, that's enough. In today's episode, we saw how the Kinahan Cartel tried to buy the life of Gerry Hutch, how an enforcer from Belfast believed he was on the brink of fortune, and how in the end, it was all for nothing. Hutch is free, Mackin is locked up, and the feud that burned through Dublin streets has left scars that will never fully heal. More unusual crime stories coming soon. Thanks for watching.